the conversation. I'm sorry, guys, for shutting the comments down, but then I'll be opening it again later on. And I have already received questions by you that I will be asking Ms. Marie later on in the live. But it will be a very nice, probably long, moderately long conversation tonight. So without further ado, I would like to ask you, Ms. Marie, the first question. Honestly, before moving to the question of how your journey to Kurdistan began in the beginning, and about yourself, I would actually like to ask you a question about like poetry, because I would like tonight to be a night for poetry. By the way, I think it was last night or the night before, it was Yelda, the longest night of the winter, which is celebrated throughout the Eastern world. And I'm like, we're just 2 days off from Yelda, so we can celebrate it now. So, Ms. Marie, one question that I have for you in the beginning is the question of what makes a poetry, or even what makes a poet a poet. So that's my first question. I know these general questions are difficult to ask. I wouldn't like myself to be asked these kind of questions, but you're a great poet, and these great questions are commensurate with your confidence.
For a devout man, you're sure breaking the golden rule very fast.
It's very kind of you.
I was worried you were going to ask questions like this, and I had the feeling that you were going to jump right in with a question like this. What makes poetry poetry? What makes a poet a poet? There are so many answers to a question like this, and none of them are conclusive. But perhaps one of the things that makes a poet is attention. The ability to and desire to pay attention, and to give attention very generously, and without expectation. That's probably where I.
Ms. Marie, so like for instance, when a poet writes, right, he's being generous, and don't you think that the poet has expectations, or that is not what you meant?
Poets with expectations are run the risk of being boring poets, I think. So one of my early teachers of poetry, used to tell me, he is a gentleman. He is a gentleman, but he is famous for not being the gentlest of teachers, which I still think makes him a very loving teacher. I never felt unloved, but he used to tell me something has to happen. The poem can't be a reference to something happening off the page. The poem has to be an event in itself. And the other thing he used to tell me too is that the poem has to hold surprise for the writer. If the writer knows exactly where the text is going, anyone reading that text can feel that predictability. Anyone reading that text can feel that sense of fatigue. Whereas when the poem really surprises a writer, when a writer discovers something as they write, you feel that. You feel that sense of discovery on the page. And part of the work of the writer is discovering what the discovery is. But part of that work too is not dulling the sense of surprise as you revise that piece of writing, as you prepare it for a reader, as you make sure that it's art. So just simply discovering something on the page isn't a poem. You have to do more work on the craft side for it to be a piece of art. But, or I guess that's my opinion. Others might disagree, that's okay. Really famous, great poets disagree with me on that. But I do think that if a poet has expectations, you feel it, and it dulls the work from the beginning.
Miss Marie, like, perhaps just before going to the question of about your life as a writer and a poet, I was just actually thinking about I came across a line that was saying what makes us different from every other creature is language. And just in preparation for tonight's live, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking maybe even what make the pinnacle of that of language is also poetry, right? My guess is that every community has some sort of poetry around the world, and it's such an interesting human invention to be able to write poetry, and a lot of the times it's backgrounded in capitalist kind of environments, you know, where a lot of the times what is materialistic, what is like of immediate significance to my senses are given precedence over meaning itself, which is sometimes not tangible, although they have correlations, you know, with the material. But I was just thinking about all of these things, and then at the same time I was reflecting on classical poetry in general, and Kurdish classical poetry. Knowing that your PhD is largely on Kurdish classical poetry, and you're putting it into conversation with other world literatures of the time, I would like to know your opinion, how you ended up stumbling upon this literature, Kurdish literature, coming from the kind of environment that you're coming from. So how did that journey begin, and how did you create that conversation between this ignored literature, largely ignored literature, and the already known literature outside Kurdistan? So I guess I'm asking the question of how you ended up in Kurdistan and ended up working with Kurdish classical poetry.
I ended up in Kurdistan. I had been working as an editor at a magazine that did long form nonfiction, and I really enjoyed working with the writers I was working with and supporting them and hearing their stories. And I realized after a while that that was what I wanted to be when I grew up. That I wanted to do storytelling like that. So I knew, and I'd always been interested in the Middle East. You know, I was 15 when the towers were hit, and I think a lot of young people in America at that point sort of had this moment where they realized they were either going to oversimplify why that had happened, or they were going to try and understand it. So actually, if you look at people of my generation when they went to college, there was this boom in the number of Arabic classes people were taking because there were just tons of people trying to understand what had happened and why it had happened. And I was one of those people. And so I had the Middle East in the back of my mind. That was something that I did horribly at learning Arabic. It was terrible.
It's a difficult language, so I
Difficult
don't.
and beautiful and very difficult.
Very difficult.
Um, but I didn't know at the time, of course, that learning Arabic was preparing me to learn Kurdish. So part of the reason that I could sound out Kurdish when I arrived was some of the characters are shared. Um, and that was a skill that I had learned as I failed college Arabic spectacularly. So I had the Middle East in the back of my mind. I had been exposed to this sort of storytelling where people were immersing themselves in other cultures. And then I had been working on myself as a poet. I was in the middle of an MFA in poetry writing. And a friend of mine emailed me, and she was working at the American University. And she said, "We're really looking for English professors, and I think you would really like working here." And she told me a little bit about the job, and I got really excited. And then conversation, the person who was interviewing me for this job, I went through about 3 different rounds of interviews. And in the second or third round of interviews, I forget, I was asking my interviewer what it was like there, what people did for fun. And he said, "Well, if you like to be outside and you like to read, this is the place for you." And I was like, "Yes, I like both of those things quite a lot." And then, and then I was talking more with him, and I was asking about the number of hospitals in Sulaimani, trying to get a feel for the city, number of schools, what types of universities were there, American University. He said, it was like somewhere in the course of this long laundry list of things I was learning about Slemani, he said the streets were named after poets. And I was like, that's it. That's for me. And so I got on a plane and I went to Slemani. And I remember I stopped in Istanbul for the night because of the way the layovers worked. And I was in my hotel room and I heard the call to prayer start to echo around the city. And I thought, wow, I'm really in the Middle East now. And then I went
Yeah.
to for a few months and lived there, and I came back to Istanbul for Thanksgiving to meet my dad, actually. And as I arrived in Istanbul, I was like, whoa, this is Europe.
That's incredible.
It's all about perspective.
That's so funny.
And then
Very
really
true.
into Slemani that I wanted to translate. I knew from my MFA program, most of my professors at my MFA program who were poets were also translators. And they talked about translation as a way to apprentice your mind to the masters, to really learn from people across time and space and language the finest elements of the craft. And so I was excited to translate. And then when I arrived, I realized how little was translated. I mean, this was 10 years ago now.
Wow.
And, Choman Hardy's work hadn't come out yet. Sherko Bekas wasn't really in English. There were a couple anthologies you could find, but they were sparse, especially given the depth of the tradition. So it was at one time very sad that the world didn't know this poetry yet, and that the Kurds hadn't been heard. But it was also very exciting that there was so many introductions to make. I mean, you think about Nali, you think about Mahwi, you think about Sheikh Raza, you think about Kurdi, Salim. I mean, there are just, how many names could you name? In English, the sports metaphor would be the bench is very deep. Even the B team poets are just incredible. So it was really exciting, and I just jumped in. I like to say that if I had known how difficult the poetry was, if I had really been able to understand that from the start, I'm not sure I would have ever started, because it's an impossible task. As you know, Kurdish classical poetry in a single 14-line poem can have upwards of 5 languages. And they're not only 5 languages of the contemporary version, it's 5 languages of the classical version of the language. So in some senses, it's 10 languages because it's double whatever we think it is. And then too, the number of references, I mean, the amount of education that these people had as they were approaching poetry is massive. All of them were sheikhs, mullahs, sayyids. All of them were incredibly educated in the Islamic sciences. So all of that is knowledge that has sort of fallen out of popular. It's fallen out of popular education.
Yeah.
Knowledge that we have to get back to translate the poetry, which is part of the reason why translating with you in the early days was so fun, because it's knowledge that you have, which is really rare these days. So it was really energizing to see the amount of poetry that hadn't been translated, even though it was a little heartbreaking as well. And then it was like being tossed headfirst into the ocean, trying to translate these poets. And we all like to say that we want an easy life, but in the end, we don't. We want the right kind of difficulty. We want challenges that make us excited about each day. So these were really good challenges.
Yes, thank you. Wow. We want the right kind of difficulty. That's
right kind of difficulty.
Ms. Marie, like one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking is this idea of you said that you need to make a lot of introductions, right? Nobody knows about Mahwi, but in Kurdistan, Mahwi is like a prophet.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they're literally sacred. Like if I curse Mahwi, I can be stoned for it on the street, you know? He's big.
Yeah.
And so, but nobody knows about it. And it's difficult. It makes you, like, as a Kurd especially, and you've lived enough in Kurdistan, that we might actually have transferred this eagerness to you as well, which is like, why nobody knows about Mahwi? Why nobody knows about Nali, you know, these great poets, and Salam and the others. And so we would like to introduce ourselves, right? Make ourselves known. And going back to the question of expectation, let's assume for a second that Nali had no expectation, but we have expectations of them, no? Like, we would like for Nali to do something for me, you know, like I want him that why do Marie basically translates for Nali, you know, and why do you make these introductions? Like what is in Nali and Mahwi that is appealing and that could be of meaning, that could be of additional value to the outside world, you know? And that could actually make a good introduction for who the Kurds are. Just before I'll let you answer this question, I was just thinking actually about I've been thinking about history a lot lately, not necessarily the events of history, but the methodology of understanding history. You know, well, how do I know that this happened and that didn't happen? And a lot of other things. And one of the things that I was thinking about, like thinking about history, is that a lot of the times in the history of this region, even if we don't have biographers, historians as much, we had poets who were telling us some sort of history. And I believe I'm of the opinion that the objectivity we look for in real historians, quote unquote, I would rather trade it off with the subjectivity of poets telling me what was going on at the time. And so I would like to hear your reflections on this thought as well, in addition to the idea of the classical Kurdish poets as means for introducing the Kurds.
These are great questions, Mohammed. I love the idea that even if a poet is coming to the page without expectations, oftentimes we limit poets by the expectations we have of them as readers. That's a really powerful thought. And I want to unpack that with you a little bit. I mean, so one of my favorite examples to bring up, but there are also other really wonderful examples that are very, very easy and obvious, is Shahraza. So in Kurdistan, everyone thinks we know what Shahraza is. Everyone thinks we know who Shahraza is. No, I mean, you say the name and people start to laugh because we think we know who he is and what he did. And in some ways, no one's wrong. He did write those poems. He did say words that I couldn't possibly look you in the eye and say. We know this. But he also said a lot of other words. And very few people get to see who I think of as the full Shahraza, the full human, because they assume they know who he is and they assume they know what he did. And Shahraza, in a way, when you dig into his life, fascinating character. One of my favorite stories about him is about how he related to his family. So his family, as we know, he's a Talibani. He comes from the Talibani family. And they started a wonderful tekia. Well, they started wonderful tekiyas and khanakas all over the place. But a wonderful tekia that I've had the privilege to visit in Kirkuk. And Shahraza's father was one of the, as the 19th century is an interesting time period because as Kurdistan, the land we call Kurdistan, really was the battleground where the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire faced off. They used Kurdish lands as a sort of proto-battleground, as a pseudo-battleground for the battles that they were really having. And Kurds, being very intelligent politicians, learned how to play those empires off of each other and also learned how to play the power game of, okay, Ottoman Empire, you need me to fight the Persians, which means that, yes, I will pay you fealty, but I won't be actually fully subservient to you. So while some of the emirates we know weren't entirely independent of the Ottoman Empire, they were more independent than they otherwise might have been had they not played that power game so well. But in the 19th century, this started to be a very difficult game. I mean, it was always a difficult game. But whenever I think about Game of Thrones, I'm always like, no, Game of Kurdistan, wait.
That's so true.
But in the 19th century, this became a very difficult game. And the physical conditions that people were living in became even more difficult than they had been. And what you see is a tremendous resurgence of Sufism. And this is generally correlated. If you look at Western Romanticism, this is exactly the correlation we see around this time period. That as social human conditions get more difficult, people really do turn to the mystical understanding of the world because it helps them terrifically. Because if you ask mysticism what the purpose of suffering is, they say suffering is love. And there's a complete reinvention of what suffering is. There's an inversion of what suffering is in any sort of mysticism, whether we're talking about, no matter what tradition we're talking about. And so the 19th century saw this resurgence of Sufism. The Naqshbandi order and the Qadri order both gained a lot of traction. The Naqshbandi order moved more quickly because they had a democratization of who was allowed to be a teacher. And so you were able to move into the ranks as a teacher, even if you had not been born into certain bloodlines, which was very people. But the Qadri order also bloomed, and the Talibani family was at the heart of that burgeoning, was at the heart of that blooming. And Shahraza was the second son, metaphorically speaking, of this very big family. And he struggled his whole life to find his place in it. What's my place in this family that's incredibly devout, incredibly powerful? Can I be accepted in it? Can I help define what it is? And in some ways, when I talk like this, I know Shahraza would hate to hear the note of pity in my voice. He would be like, he would say some choice words to me. I'm sure. Don't
Message
but
received.
message received. But his voice was sharp, and at one point he told the Shah of Iran, "I can't come serve in your court as a court poet because my tongue is so sharp that I know it would only be a matter of time before it cut someone, and I want us to always be friends. So I won't bring my sword near you because I don't want it to cut you. I will stay far enough away that we can remain friends." You know, and that is Shahraza. That is Shahraza. A man who was incredibly devout, who was incredibly conflicted about who he was, but was also bigger, was also so big, which in some senses is Sufism, right? Sufism is boundless. Sufism is about relating to God in ways that are terrifying. And Mahwi does that in a way that's easy for us to relate to. Mahwi does it in a way that's easy for us to see as beautiful. Shahraza does it in a way that's harder for us to see as beautiful, but is just as essential to beauty. Because Shahraza is actually boundless. There is no territory that's off limits to him. And that to him, my argument is that to him is Sufism. That to him is devotion. So when we talk about expectations of poets and expectations we have as readers, the thing I would tell you is that, again, expectations make you stupid. Expectations make you dull. I don't mean stupid in the sense of lower intelligence. I mean it in the sense of they dull your mind because they tell you, I know what that is. When really, if you ask the question, what is that? You're opening yourself to a much more interesting world. We think of Nali as much cleaner than Shahraza, but in some ways Nali was much more subversive than Shahraza. Nali was Shahraza always apologized, right? He would go into that boundless territory and then he would come back and he would
Yeah.
God, I'm the thorn of my family. I'm the thorn to the rose. I'm the smoke to the fire. I'm the foam to the sea. Nali never apologized. Nali never apologized. He said, okay, the metaphor of God is that God is my beloved. Great, bring my beloved to me. Let me touch my beloved. That's much more transgressive in many ways. But no one thinks about that because we think we know who Nali is. So expectations can really, I love that idea. Expectations can really dull us to who's really out there. The second question you had was poetry as history, and this relates again to the 19th century and really to one of the unique aspects of Kurdish poetry and Kurdish culture that I've seen in other cultures in the region, like Yazidi culture, which is a culture I've gotten to know really in the last few years from a friend, poet, and fellow translator, Zaidan Khalaf, who's part of sort of a group of Yazidi poets, including Ahmad Bashar, who we're going to work with more in the future here, which is going to be really exciting. But, you know, now, especially in America, poetry is what we call siloed. It is set apart from everything else. So it's not a part of everything else. It is its own distinct category. This is poetry. And in some ways that's helped professionalize the industry, and it's made poets be able to find more support in places like academia. But in other ways, it's really pulled poetry away from the fabric of humanity. And in Kurdistan, one of the really exciting things to me as a poet is how integrated poetry still is with society. You look at a poet like Abdulla Pashew, they're still giving readings to thousands of people. People still memorize his poetry. I mean, I went to a reading of Abdulla Pashew's. Literally, people were sitting 3 people to a chair. So one boy would sit in the chair and 2 boys would sit on that boy's knees. And that was how almost every single boy in the audience was sitting, to make more room so that more people could see Abdulla Pashew read. I can't emphasize to you how very foreign that is to an American poet, for whom a reading of 20 to 40 people is phenomenal. Like, you did a great job. Once I hosted a reading for Sherko Bekas, when his book had been banned by or not officially banned, but was sort of
Yes.
Now a Girl Is
Appreciate
My
it.
was a challenging book for the authorities in the KRG.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know that his book, he hadn't been able to read it in any of the official big halls that they would normally host a reading in. So I invited him to come read at the American University. He came, 250 people came. And I thought this was a wild success. And Sherko was very angry. And it was only years later that I realized he was angry because he should have been reading to a crowd of 2,000 people, because that's what he was used to. But from the perspective of an American poet who had just arrived in Kurdistan, I was like, this is amazing. This is phenomenal. I've never seen this before in my life. So poetry is still very integrated with the social fabric of Kurdistan, which is really exciting. And it also means that poets can do more work. Poets are doing more work for the Kurdish people because they are speaking to the Kurdish people. There's very much still a social contract between poets and people. And that social contract is very evident in the 19th century, when not only was there a deep social contract between poets and people, but poetry was one of the main sources of transmitting knowledge. So you mentioned Mahwi is almost a prophet. Mahwi is sacred. You're right. In the 19th century, Mahwi was taught. Mahwi was taught in school because Mahwi was a way of learning one way of thinking about Islam. Mahwi was a way of learning language. Mahwi was a way of learning history. And really, too, this is a side of all of the poets, that they were trying to write their age. And poets are still doing this. It's not like poets have stopped trying to be relevant. But in the 19th century, that sense of relevance is just really immediate and very clear. And just as your former professor, I would like to congratulate you on retaining your critical thinking skills. That maybe historians today claim objectivity, but is that even really possible? What does that mean? And maybe simply being aware of your bias, which is not a simple act at all, is the only objectivity we can really strive for. And certainly poets, great poets, are very good at knowing where they stand and knowing where they're writing from. So very happy to hear that thought in there as well. Long answer, but you did ask 3 questions.
No, that was incredible. I have a lot of thoughts to reflect on now already. Ms. Marie, one question, like a personal question to you. When you meet people on the streets, right? Random Kurdish people, like in restaurants, or even when you have a chance to talk with them, or other people, not so random people, but Kurdish people. When you meet them, so we have an idea. We say like that our poets best represent us, right? The Kurds. So, for instance, when you look at the politicians, they're in the game of manipulation, right? In a sense, or we look at them with some sort of suspicion, let's say. But when it comes to the poets, some of them at least, we say like Pashew is our voice. You know, like just recently he posted a poem, and everybody on social media was like just sharing it and cherishing it, and they were like as though seeking refuge. This is what I've been trying to say, and he's saying it, and I want to be part of that by sharing it, you know, even further. And so my question is when you meet a Kurd, do you see the poetry that you read in them, and how so? Even you can like reflect on your immediate students, you know, like when you look at Shene Pishtiwan, Sarwar, you know, like a lot of these people that you have the chance to, and they have the chance to be in conversation with each other, and do you see that Nali in some ways might have affected the way they think about life, they think about themselves, you know, all of these things. Again, general and generic questions, but
very, very big, important questions. I do feel.
I was even thinking you might even tell us a little bit about Sheikh Ali as well. Maybe that's a good example. I don't know. I'm just pitching it in.
I do feel the love of Kurdish literature when I meet the average Kurd. So, and I feel it in simple ways as well as more complex ways. So, people ask how I started learning Kurdish. And the way I started learning Kurdish was I would go to the bazaar and I taught myself how to say awachia. And so I would go through the bazaar and I would, every time I saw a shopkeeper who was not busy with customers, I would sit and I would say in his shop, awachia, awachia, awachia. And then I would just learn. So, and at the time I didn't know whether I was learning the word for onion or the word for white. Because of course, is telling that's a white onion. And
yes.
so it's a white, and he's saying, no, it's an onion. Awa piaz. Piaz. Okay, piaz. Spinia, spinia. No, spi. And you're like, okay, it is spi, but this other thing that is purple is also piaz. Okay, piaz means onion.
Yeah, piaz. The common denominator.
So this was the way I learned Kurdish, was really just through the patience of strangers in the bazaar, of shopkeepers in the bazaar. And that's a way of loving Kurdish literature, is loving the Kurdish language. In Arabic has a proverb that says, everything that is forbidden is required. And in some ways, I think that's very true about the Kurdish language, that it's been persecuted for so long that the speakers of Kurdish know it's up to them to keep it. If Kurds don't keep the language, it will not be kept. And there is that awareness in the common person in Kurdistan, which it's invigorating, it's enlivening to talk with people who care that much about their language. So I see the love of Kurdish literature in very fundamental ways like that. But then also in much deeper ways, as you intimated with individuals like Sheikh Ali, Sheikh Yusuf, Shene, Pishtiwan, Sarwar, you, I mean, all of the people I've worked with over the years are willing to sacrifice almost anything to serve their literature. So, Sheikh Ali, you mentioned Sheikh Ali, and we're talking here about Sheikh Ali Karadahi, who is a real protector, a real, I get emotional when I talk about it because I know how much he has sacrificed, how much his family has sacrificed. He is a real protector of Kurdish culture. He started collecting manuscripts when it was illegal. And when he was prosecuted, not persecuted, prosecuted, when he went to trial under Saddam Hussein for having collected his manuscripts, his library was used as the evidence against him. And then it was burned. He had already spent 9 months in jail, where he said in an interview with me, he said that the cheapest thing in that jail was life. And he had already spent 9 months in jail. The trial that found him guilty sentenced him to 6 months. And in the interview, his son was there, Dr. Amjad, and Dr. Amjad made a joke. He said, yes, we always used to joke that the Ba'athist owed my father 3 months of his life.
3 months, yeah. I remember, I was there.
You were there. And this is I mean, his family they're laughing. but also this is true. The Baathists owed Sheikh Ali not just 3 months, but 9. Um, and I asked Sheikh Ali, I said, so when you exited jail, when you were freed, how long did it take you to start collecting again? And I thought that maybe out of fear, frankly, out of fear of his life, out of fear for his family, he would have taken a while to start collecting again. It might have taken him time. And he laughed and he said, no, you misunderstand. When I left prison, I was, in Kurdish, you would say warmer to the work.
Yes.
I was more ready for it. I was more
Enthusiast.
Yeah, almost more aggressive. Like I wanted to do that much more. That's an intense love of literature. His son joked also, again, this is Dr. Amjad, he said that his children, sometimes they knew they went hungry for a dinner one night because their father needed to buy a book. I'm not saying that we want children to go hungry. Obviously we don't. But
right.
That's a beautiful level of dedication for children to know, this is what my father is doing. This is what my family is doing through my father. My family is contributing to my father's work by agreeing that tonight we won't eat dinner, we'll buy a book. I mean, that's incredible. And I see it in the new generation as well. It's very easy to be disillusioned or disenchanted with your own culture, and I understand that. I feel that myself about American culture very deeply. But I think it's important to re-enchant. And I see a lot of young people in Kurdistan re-enchanting Kurdish literature for themselves. So you mentioned Sewanee and Pishtiwan, Sarwar. Those are 3 people whose lives are literature. Sarwar is working 2 full-time jobs and is doing that because he cares so much about the Sulaimani's UNESCO designation as a city of literature, but also doesn't want to stop developing himself as a translator and as a writer, and so is still working full-time for Kashkul. Sarwar probably works about 80 to 100 hours a week because he loves what he does and he thinks it's important. Sewanee and Pishtiwan are in Iowa because they chose to make their lives about Kurdish literature. When I see Sewanee translate Rafiq Sabir, she was meant to do it. She was built to read those poems. She was built to translate those poems. And she has spent the last 8 years of her life preparing herself to translate them beautifully. So I see the love of Kurdish literature in many Kurdish people. I don't mean to over-romanticize it. I know there are Kurdish people who don't care about literature. I know that's true.
Right.
But there are many who do. Yeah. And you asked me where I see it, so I get to be a little romantic in the answer to that question.
That's true. I mean, that definitely is true. I mean, a lot of people, unfortunately, now when even speaking of myself, a lot of us, even complain about the idea that the younger generation are not paying as much attention to poetry and literature compared to the earlier one. In fact, that was one of the questions that a friend of mine who's memorized Mahwi and Nali collections, like these are collections of poetry in 1 year. He's just sad. He loved them so much. He has them in the heart. Like whenever a conversation comes up about anything, we sometimes when we gather, we would just say mother, and then he would be telling us what Mahwi thought of mother and Nali thought of mother. He actually knows Farsi, so he brings like Hafiz's poetry and Rumi's. It's like you're sitting in a setting where books are speaking, are in conversation with each other, collections of poetry. And so he was complaining about that. He was saying why the contemporary Kurdish poets are not as revered as the classical ones, or they're not as read for, especially in the Kurdish context. Maybe that's even true on some levels in English literature. Like when you say Shakespeare, you know, everybody has an idea about who that person was. So I actually wonder why that is so. The more we move to the classical times, maybe that's very subjective of me thinking like that, or my friend. But I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's always easy to look back and to think that a different age was better.
Mm.
And that is very seldom true.
Mm.
It is easy to see. We all know Shakespeare because we've all agreed that Shakespeare is worth knowing over centuries of Shakespeare have, you know, around as an author. And that's sort of what the world does is we anthologize as we go. So, you know, an anthology is a gathering of poets we think should be read and remembered. And we make anthologies over time for certain purposes. You know, I know that my partner David and Zaidan are working on an anthology of, I believe it's poets who were martyred by Saddam. That's an anthology for a particular purpose, but it's also postulating, it's also imagining that it's important to remember those poets now, not in their entirety, not in their full collection, but in their selected works.
Mm.
The world does that over time informally. So we all agree that the three pillars of the Babans, okay, we being people who know Kurdish literature, we all agree, I'm trying to get the world to agree on this one, that it's important to remember the three pillars of the Babans, no?
Right. Meaning the three poets.
Yes. Pillars are poets.
Yes.
So that in a way is anthologizing those poets. When you actually look back at the 19th century, there are hundreds more poets that we're not remembering, that we don't read. Frankly, because they didn't have as many hits.
Right.
If you think about poets as rock stars, you know, each poet has a certain number of hits, a certain number of number one.
Right.
And the more number ones a poet has, the more we remember them, the more we read them.
Right. Right.
And so it is easy because we're looking back to think that we are reading the poets of the 19th century. In a way, no, you're not. You're just reading the 10 best poets of the 19th century.
Right. Right. And maybe even not the best 10 poets, because honestly, there's a book recently published by Ahmed Shamsi. He's a great scholar in Islamic studies, and he's a historian. The name is called Rediscovering Islamic Classics, and I read it. It was fascinating. It was like about how the classics, we know them as classics, were just lucky to find themselves in prints in the 19th century. So a lot of the times it was the editors and the people working in the printing houses that they were, for instance, bringing this writer into light and not many others. And so how do these people become giants is also worth reflecting on.
Incredibly subjective process, how we decide who is the best. The word best is a value judgment. It's a value judgment.
Right.
So you got it. I mean, that's it. So when we look at the contemporary landscape, it's easy to think people aren't paying attention to poets. And in some ways, they're not. People don't sit around in diwakhans and recite poetry for each other anymore. That's not really what happens as a form of entertainment.
Right.
Sad, and of course I wish I had seen that.
Right.
But there are more poets writing now, perhaps, than there ever have been.
Right.
And more ways of distributing that poetry than there ever have been, if you think about social media. which is both negative and positive. So all I'm saying, I guess, is
Yes.
Take heart. Dildanawa.
Right.
Because it, oh, that would have been a really good translation. Huh? Take heart. That's what it is. It's not comfort. It's taking heart.
Heart.
But I was looking for that translation the other day and I couldn't figure it out. But take heart, because there are things about our age that are really exciting. We don't have diwa khans anymore, but we do have
coffee shops.
Yeah, but we do have coffee shops, and I mean, it sounds silly to say, but we also have Instagram, and we also have Twitter, and we also have Facebook, and all those things are ways of reaching people and finding your audience. Right. So yes.
Yeah, that. Yes and no, I think is a very academic answer. In a world where we want less academic answers. But one question, Ms. Marie. When I think about poets, especially the Kurdish classical poetry, I think of them as a legacy. Like when I'm like, they have left something behind. You know, that like they did something, they created something, and they left it to us. You know, for us. I was wondering, so just to pause, actually, one of the questions that this was actually asked by David. So I want to move to you, like away from the Kurdish poetry.
Sure.
He was saying like, I would like to know how her work in translation and in Kurdistan more generally has influenced her own poetry. So just have that in mind, while if you could touch up on the question of translation as a genre, which was Sarwar's question. He was asking how can we look at translation more than just a bridge between different languages, but rather as a craft on its own, standing on its own. And so if you could reflect on both questions, that would be nice. And I think they're great ones.
Those are great questions. As soon as you said David and Sarwa had asked questions, I was like, uh-oh, I might be in trouble. So lately I've been thinking a lot about, I was telling you earlier, before we started the conversation, that I've been spending the last few months working on my own manuscript of poetry, which partially has taken me so long to do because I believe so much in translation. It's hard for me to want to spend time on my own work when I care so much and love so much the work of these poets, the work of these Kurdish poets. But as I've been thinking about my own writing, I've been thinking a lot about the value of misunderstanding. The value of getting it wrong. And translation is great for this because you are inevitably going to misunderstand. And partially you're going to misunderstand because there is no one correct understanding. Each time we read a poem, we're making that poem anew right then. And certainly every time we translate a poem, we are coming to a new understanding of it in that moment that can never be the same again. What translation does for me is it frees my mind to play with language because I know there isn't one right way. I know that I am inevitably going to fail. So I can I can embrace the failure. I can embrace the impossibility. And I can play with language to say, all right, accept the failure. It is happening. Now what? Now what? And living in Kurdistan for 10 years taught me nothing if it didn't teach me how much daily life is misunderstanding. You know, how much daily life is stumbling into things that we don't know are about to happen or that we don't understand are happening. You know, one of my favorite translation problems, translation issues that I had, and Mohammed, I'm going to ask your permission to say a bad word in Kurdish to tell the story. Is that okay?
Please, please, yes, of course.
So I was teaching a translation workshop at the American University. I was the department chair, and I was trying to have my students listen to Kurdish as if it were foreign to them, just as sound, not as meaning, but as sound. And I was trying to get them to see that part of poets' work is in sound, right? If I wanted to tell you the world is amazing, I could just say, Mohammed, the world is amazing. But if I want you to feel the world is amazing, and I'm writing a poem about that, I'm trying to get you to feel that in a number of ways, through image, through sound, through line break, through structure, through all of these different tools that poets have, which is another answer for what makes a poet, is how well are they using the craft of language? How many tools are they using? What effect? And I was trying to get my students to hear this. And as you know about me, I'm a very earnest person. And I was very frustrated that they weren't hearing it, that they kept hearing Kurdish as Kurdish instead of as sound. And so I was trying to help them see that in the end of this poem, which was it was called The Peddler and the Pack Mule by Abdulla Pashew. And there were a bunch of K and R sounds at the end of the poem that were very stressful, where Abdullah was trying to create stress in the body of the listener by these repeated K and R sounds. So in frustration, I finally said, guys, can't you hear it? Cut, 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 cut.
That's
in that room, their eyes went big as dinner plates, just like,
right. Oh, yeah. By the way, guys, just for those of you who don't know Kurdish, ker means
oh, I'm about
donkey.
to say,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Not entirely what it means, is it though? And
yeah,
so
also,
what I realized,
depending on the sound, yeah.
What I realized, I was like, I must have said something, and my brain was racing. I was like, what did I say? What did I say? What did I say? And all of a sudden, I remembered translating a Shahraza poem, and I was like, oh my
God.
I just said, dick donkey, dick donkey, dick donkey, dick donkey, dick donkey. The whole, like, I couldn't, and I was like, oh no, oh my God. And I really thought to myself, I was like, okay, if I acknowledge that this happened, if I acknowledge it, then it happened. But if I don't acknowledge this, it didn't happen. So I looked at my students without missing a beat, and I was like, guys, can't you hear it? And all the
we hear it.
And a few years later, I went to see a student who'd been in this class. She went on to a master's degree at Tufts. And I went to see her, and I was like, you know, hey, Dina, I was just wondering, do you remember that day translation class? And she was like, oh, miss, we all remember that day.
Right.
I didn't even tell her what day it was. She was like, no, we remember
the day. It was the day.
You know, and this is the funny example of misunderstanding, right? Is that I would never in a million years say that to my students, never in a million years. But of course, you know,
language being sound.
Language is sound. I was thinking of sound. You don't even think about the misunderstanding, but misunderstanding can also be much more serious. You know, I think about our friend Haure Khalid, who is an amazing photojournalist. an amazing photographer, an amazing human. And he and I were talking about the first day I saw a dead body. And we were talking about how I had been traveling over this bridge in Mosul, this floating bridge in Mosul, the province of Mosul, right outside of Guyana. I was there doing oral history and collecting stories, and I was just excited to be crossing the Tigris. I just thought it was amazing. I just thought it was the coolest thing to be over that river. And I started taking a picture, and my driver laughed, and he said, "What are you doing? The body's on the other side."
Wow, that's powerful.
It was an interesting moment. And the body was clothed all in black, and it was significantly bloated, almost sort of unrecognizable as a human, except that you always recognize the form. And I didn't think to ask until weeks later. Well, so then what he said was, I said, "Why do they leave the body in the river?" Because I know Islam, and I know the Islamic traditions around burial are incredibly respectful and incredibly important, and that no one would ever do that. And he said, "Well, it's ISIS." And at the time, I had just spent my day in an IDP camp, and the people within the camp had misunderstood. They had misunderstood what kind of doctor I was when I was introduced as Dr. Marie LaBrosse, and they had started bringing their children to me, their sick children to me. And I didn't understand what was happening, so I was receiving these sick children one at a time and trying to listen to each person as they were telling me what was happening with their children. I thought the nicest thing I could do, at least, was to listen. Even if I couldn't help the children, I could listen. And over time I realized, no, I am creating a misunderstanding, because the longer I sit here and listen to them, the more they think I can help them, and I can't help them. Not the way they want me to. And so eventually I simply had to get up and leave, which was a terrific feeling of helplessness and really a terrific amount of rage to not be able to help sick children who are blameless in that they're sick. And so when my driver, and of course are sick because they're in an IDP camp, and are in an IDP camp because ISIS destroyed their homes. So when my driver said, "That's an ISIS body, so we leave it there," I accepted that. So you can see the layers of misunderstanding in this story.
See.
And later, actually, with you, Mohammed, we went to visit Soran Omer. Yes. Because we're doing interviews for our project about how devotion becomes violent. Once violent, how can devotion become peaceful again? And we were interviewing Soran Omer about this, and he told us a story about how...
By the way, Soran Omer is, by the way, he's the head of the Human Rights Committee in the Kurdistan Parliament. Yeah, I'm sorry, Ms. Marie, for the interruption.
No, I'm glad to know that. He was telling us this story about how the last time he had spoken to an American in an interview was when he had wanted to prove to the Americans that his group of Islamists were peaceful. So he had gotten together a bunch of American journalists, and he had taken them out to the camp, and then he had driven them back. And that night, while he was driving the American journalists back, there was a precision strike, and all of his friends were killed. He alone survived.
Yeah.
And I realized he started to weep. And I realized that I looked a lot like a journalist to him. And I realized how much courage it was taking for him to speak with me. And I didn't know if it was shameful or not for him to be crying. I wasn't sure what the cultural norms around that were. But I wanted him to know that I saw him and I cared about him. And in the wintertime, I always carry a handkerchief, a clean handkerchief in my pocket.
Yeah.
And I took out this handkerchief and I put it in the middle of the table.
Yeah.
And because he's a devout Muslim as well, it was important for him that we not be making eye contact.
Right.
It was important for him that he know he wasn't looking at me as a woman, but that he was relating to me as a mind.
Yes.
I set down the handkerchief without looking at him. He picked it up without looking at me, wiped his eyes, and put it back down.
Yeah, I was there as well. So
You were
I
there as
saw that.
well.
He was showing you a video as well of
He showed
one of
video.
the videos.
Fascinated. It was a very emotional day. And he trusted me with a lot. And it was after that interview that I realized, you know, here I am in this interview with this peaceful jihadist, weeping with him over how he was treated as a Muslim. And yet it didn't occur to me to ask how my driver knew that that body in the river was ISIS. Okay, he was wearing black clothes. How do we know that how do we know what that meant? And even more important, how does that give us permission to treat that person like an animal, worse than an animal? And why did I feel that I had permission to dismiss that person as a person, even if they're ISIS? And even worse, so I was telling this story to Howdy, and we were talking about this because Howdy was in Mosul at that same time and saw more than I did, and saw similar things. And he and I were talking about this, and he said, Marie, it's even worse. I think that the public authorities told people that those bodies were ISIS because they didn't have the infrastructure to actually clear the bodies out of the river. Their social infrastructure was so stressed in terms of providing people in the city with fresh water and food and medical care and education and roads that they didn't have the manpower to clear the river. Layers and layers and layers and layers of misunderstanding in that one moment of dismissing the body in the river. And I've thought a lot about how translation is misunderstanding, how meaning is misunderstanding, and how to make meaning from misunderstanding, which is a lot of what my recent work in poetry and my own poetry is centered around. This is a very long answer for you, Mohammed, but mostly because it takes us a very long time to understand what we're misunderstanding. I mean, it took me years to understand what I was seeing in the river. It took me years to even be able to, in my mind, look back at what I saw in the river. So that's my thought in this current moment about translation and my own creative work. And very much to translation and I like Sarwa's question, translation as its own art form, not as a... Translation is intransitive. Translation is intransitive versus transitive. Translation as its own ends instead of as a means to an end. Again, a very long answer, but something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Yeah.
That's incredible. I honestly, there's a lot to talk about. I have a lot more questions, but I know that we've been talking for over an hour now, and
Yeah.
it went by just like minutes. Saror is saying, I'm not going to cry at all. but that was actually very intense, and yeah, it's provoking a lot of thoughts. So my friends, if you guys have any questions for Ms. Marie, or any follow-up questions, by the way, Muhammad and Isa, they were saying hi, uh, your former students and your friends from
Muhammad Isa the third.
yes. Uh,
Who is chopping those onions?
a lot of nice comments. So, Ms. Marie, one other thing that I wanted to ask you is Kashkul. How did you come up with the idea of Kashkul, and how did you found it, and where is it going? Where is it now, and where is it going?
Kashkul was formed because I was translating Kurdish poetry, classical Kurdish poetry, and I needed a lot of help. And so I turned to yours truly, to Mohammed Fatih Mohammed, and to Sewanee. I would really love to come back to Iraq. I miss Kurdistan and Iraq every single day.
Yeah, me too.
I turned to Sewanee and Srusht and Savan and you, Mohammed, for help translating. And as I got to know you all and I got to know what you were interested in, what I really saw was that you guys were helping me answer questions, but what I wanted to do was see what questions you wanted to answer and help you answer those questions. And so we actually formed Kashkul as an arts collaborative, a research and arts collaborative, to help emerging Kurdish and Iraqi scholars connect with the global community, connect with themselves as researchers and translators and scholars, connect with the global community. And that's a really good question about the female poetry. We should talk about that. And so that was how Kashkul got formed. Now it's the Center for Arts and Culture at the American University. We have had really amazing successes. We're working on 2 grants with the British government now. We have the 2nd largest oral history database in the Middle East. All of our emerging scholars from the 1st generation have gone on to fully funded programs abroad in 3 different continents. And we successfully helped the city, Slemani, apply for the UNESCO designation to become a city of literature in 2019. So Kashkul has sort of grown pretty organically into this amazing organization. And where it's going is really just more of the same, to be a haven for young people who care about these issues and who want to make these issues their life work, and to help those young people connect with mentors and scholars, but also really to help those young people see how much power they have and see how interesting they are and how much work they can do with the competencies they have. So that's Kashkul's future, where it came from, where it is, where it's going.
Yes, Ms. Marie, you've got some very nice comments. This guy is saying nice things. Sometimes when I translate poetry, even I'm amazed at how good I am. I guess that's very nice.
I'm that level of confidence.
Yeah, that's very nice. I just want to meet you. You're such amazing, knowing such an amazing person. I wonder if you both can continue doing lives and make a series of them to share your. Okay, and you have got a lot of heart. I love a brain teaser. A book she would recommend, English, Beautiful Mind, Marie. What is your opinion about female poetry? Did she searched about any of them? Have you come across any of them? And My friend Renwar. That was an outstanding discussion, Ahmed. I wholeheartedly thank Miss Marie for all that she's done for Kurdish language and literature. Hope all the best in her
I
life.
know Khaluk is asking. He doesn't even have to finish the question. When will we
Yeah.
expand Baghdad?
Yes, good. That's on point, by the way. American
Mohammed
University of Iraq Sulaimani.
and Kashkul to Baghdad when you start it. That's the expansion.
That's the
Uh,
expansion.
I
Uh,
I I want to take that question about the female poets if it's okay.
yes, please.
Um, so because I focus so much on the 19th century, it's easy to see that because the 19th century is a lot of male poets. But there are so many female poets writing now and really in the last century in Kurdistan who are incredible. So one of the projects I'm working on now is a book-length translation from Hero Kurda, who I love. The first book I translated and had published was of Kajal Ahmed's poetry. And I just really encourage you guys to go find those poets and read those poets. They're incredible. The women of Kurdish poetry are powerhouses. They are Sherajin. So I know we've spoken a lot about the 19th century male poets, but I have equal and great affection for the contemporary ladies. So yes, definitely go find them. That's a great question.
Miss Marie, now that you have a baby and you've become a mother, by the way, big congratulations.
Thank you.
What does it look like to be a poet and a mother?
I don't entirely know yet. I feel like I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure that out.
By the way, Miss Marie, just sorry to interrupt you, just to give you also, Sarwar is saying, who's your favorite, me or Saman? Speaking of children.
You're all my favorites.
That's what a mother would always say.
I was actually going to say Sedwar and Saman and Laja are heading up our project on translating Pyramid, which is one of our big projects at Kashkul that we've had for years now. Poor Savan and Shene threw themselves on that pyre. But we're actually close to finishing the book now, which is very exciting. And Pyramid is a really interesting figure of anthologizers. If you're interested in Kurdish literary history and the way that Kurdish literary history has been formed, go back and read Zheen and Jianawa. Go back and read Pyramid's articles. Go to Zheen Archives when it's open again after COVID and read the newspapers, because that's a major way that Kurdish literary history was formed, particularly for the 19th century. But what was the question, Mohammed? I lost it. Oh, motherhood.
Yes.
Overwhelming.
I guess.
Being a parent is overwhelming. Being a parent, becoming a parent made me want to go to my own parents, which I have, and thank them for supporting my move to Kurdistan, which scared them endlessly, and they faced their fear so that they could understand what I loved. My dad has visited me 3 times now in Kurdistan. His wife has come to visit in Kurdistan. My husband's parents have come to visit in Kurdistan. Their sisters have come to visit in Kurdistan. All of them really have faced a lot to understand what I love and why, and I really appreciate that. It made me want to go to the parents of every single students and thank them for how brave they are to send their children to a university that they don't understand. I think a lot of it made me respect even more the mothers I know who live in love and not in fear, because it is so easy to be afraid for your child. And the much bigger freedom is to have faith in love. And the mothers I respect the most and admire the most are mothers who do that. And I've been thinking about that a lot. And then your world is, I mean, I was talking about this with David, my partner, because we don't feel that our child has magically filled up some hole that we were carrying around in our life. We don't feel like our lives before our child were meaningless. They were filled with meaning that still matters. But it's almost like the very word meaning has gotten bigger and can encompass more. So, you know, I think about loving Kurdistan and loving Kurdish literature. And I think about how excited I am for my child to visit Kurdistan for the first time, or to meet the Kashkulers. And it just makes all of my love for Kurdistan and all of my love for the Kashkulers that much bigger. So I don't totally know the answer to that question. But it's only been 3 months. I think I'll just still be figuring it out.
I guess your idea of what poetry should be, which was about giving attention. I think that's what a kid does to a mother. So mothers are probably very good at being generous and giving attention. Maybe even seeking attention from the baby.
Little kids, I mean, the coolest thing about our baby is how new everything is. So if you're thinking about paying attention, I mean, up until a few weeks ago, Lyle, our baby, couldn't even see a certain distance. You know, they could only see this far, and it was a little bit blurry.
Yes.
And as they see farther, they discover other things. But it's tiny things too. Like, you know, when Lyle is able to hold their head up, I'm so proud. And it's like, you know, in what world is holding your head up that big a deal? It's not. We all do it every day, but it's a huge deal for Lyle. And I'm so proud.
Yes.
Lyle figured out how to like blow bubbles. So Lyle figured and I was ridiculously proud. I thought it was the coolest thing. Every time Lyle does it, David and I do it back. And Lyle is learning conversation because we're blowing bubbles. You know, it's you know, it means nothing, but it means everything. So
incredible.
So yeah.
Miss Marie, one just before we end the live.
Yeah.
I would actually like for you to read us some poetry, both in Kurdish and in English,
Sure.
and maybe even read us one of your own poetry, and that would be such a nice note to end the live with. It was truly incredible talking to you, as always.
It was really...
It's every time is such a revelation. I'm very grateful for you taking the time and talking to all of us. And more people will be seeing it later.
Really good questions about ladies. Yes, Mastura is amazing. She is someone I really want to translate. Mohammed, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but Mastura is
please. Yes.
She's, you know, we would say she's my holy grail. Like I don't speak the dialect of Kurdish that she wrote in, and I don't speak Farsi, and so I'm dying to translate her. I think she is, I mean, you can't imagine you can't make up a cooler figure than the second wife of the last prince of the Ardelans, who wanted to compete with the first wife for her husband's affection, so taught herself how to write poetry, and then became this amazing poet who Nali responded to because she moved in exile to Slemani. I mean, she's an amazing figure. So
Yes.
yeah, love her. Anyway, but yes, Mohammed, I'm happy to read poetry.
Yes.
Should I do that? Is that what you want me to do now?
Yes. I'm all ears now.
Okay. So I'll start with one of my own and we'll end with a little while ago,
Amazing.
poems come out in this collection of poetry, which is published by a publisher who also is a coffee roaster and distributor. So it's in a coffee bag, which is very cool.
That's very cool.
And guest edited by our dear friend Forrest Gander, who I just can't believe that Forrest wanted to include my poem in this. It was really exciting. So I will read you that poem. Okay. And this is a poem I chose because Mohammed was here for this poem with me, and actually I quote Mohammed in the poem. So
Oh my God.
Mohammed might like to hear it.
Thank you so much.
Of course, Begelman. The road was closed. The road was closed, but the guards had been students of a teacher who was with us, so we drove on. The road was closed, so it was empty, and the dead men, no one had moved them because they had stood in life with men of the black flag. Someone would salvage their trucks, but the dead men would rot, maybe find a river, and bloat past recognition into fish food. How many people will eat the fish? How many people will get sick like this? The road was closed, and who were we to the militias who patrolled it? So we drove as fast as we could among the craters, the landscape made military. We drove so fast, the young man in the back seat leaned forward. Gently, he said, "Doctor, my mother loves me." The driver, the doctor, laughed. He had driven tanks, the army, the war, the draft. If a man must die, the doctor said, he should die like a mountain. The road was closed at every checkpoint, but we drove home. But the road was closed.
Wow. It's amazing how those lines take you back to the exact moments, in the car. Such a powerful means.
I'm glad you like it. Okay, and then I'll end with a poem from Abdulla Pashew. I'll read the Kurdish first and then the English.
Yes, please.
This is from Dictionary of Midnight, which you can find at one of my favorite bookstores in Kurdistan, Payek Bookstore.
Yes.
Started by an amazing team of young people. Again, if you want to be inspired by how much young people care about literature in Kurdistan, look to Payek Bookstores.
It's amazing, yes.
It really is.
Jiwa and the others.
Okay. Gianawa. Jarjara kham tahawkam day. Azar dagata radik. Jinam badam babardekta. Wardi bakam wak badek. Kachi. Lapar. Warshay hawday hizraki nwe. Saratat kay kalkalaya. Giana way penjagyaya. Zarda khanay korpalaya. Bajnu balay sharajanay. Singi sarkeshi kharpanay. Wam ledakan. La khoshian lambar webal. La asman beparemawa. Per dijinam wadrejka na parmawa. Bahazar sal.
Oh, beautiful.
You.
Oh my God.
You can't go wrong reading Pashew, right?
Definitely.
Resurrection. From time to time, sadness fills my throat and pain reaches its limit. Then I wish to smash my life like a wine glass against a stone. But suddenly the gleam of the thread of a new idea, imagination's hide and seek, the revival of a blade of grass, the burst of an infant's laughter, the figure of beauty, the rebellious breasts of an ample woman, compel me to take wings from happiness, to beg the heavens to stretch the bridge of my life so long I won't be able to cross it, even in 1,000 years.
Oh,
I thought we might all
Miss
need to hear these days.
100%. And Miss Marie, one of the things that I actually miss is poetry and reading. Like, and it sounds and it's incredible to be able to read poetry correctly, like and the way the poet that would be that and the way the poet would be proud of you reading it that way. And again, to your point, that poetry is not always is not only the meaning, but it's also the sound. And mashallah, you're such a reciter. Seriously, I hope when you come back to Kurdistan, you teach us a little bit uh, of how your ability to read in such a manner. I was actually, when I was advertising for this live, I was telling my friends that you have to come to this live because even the way she speaks is like poetry, and indeed it is. I'm not flattering you. It's such a humbling uh, and very, very nice experience uh, that I'm always grateful for, knowing you from the beginning, 6, 7 years ago, and growing that friendship and meeting a lot of other people. Like, without you, I would have never met David and so many other people. And you all are a huge part of who I am, even though we are not talking as often. But I'm very grateful. Miss Marie, if you have any last words, I would appreciate you telling us, and then I will be ending the live. It was really great, but I don't want to take more of your time because you're a mother, and I respect the time of a mother.
Thank you. Last words. It's really just a pleasure to sit around and talk about Kurdish poetry. It's a pleasure to see everyone in the comments hear so much about it, and it's just a lovely thing to gather together and share that for a while. So thank you for the opportunity, Mohammed, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. Oh, the mugs.
Yes. Thank you all very much.
Gave it to me. I'm so sorry. I don't remember.
Marie, by the way, Dr. Rabin is the person who I told you about, that who is like very well conversant with the Kurdish classical poetry. He quotes Yahya Kamal saying reading poetry is much harder than writing it. So that's such a nice note to end the life with. Thank you all.
So remember, it's easy to do to read a poem is just read it. Just honestly read it. That's all you have to do. People build it up and they think, oh, I can't possibly read classical Kurdish poetry because I can't possibly understand it. But all those poets wanted to do is to talk to you. And every time you read it, even if you misunderstand it, you're listening. And that is what those poets wanted. So yes, the hardest thing to do is read a poem, but also the simplest thing to do is just read a poem. How's that?
That's
good, Mohammed, right?
That's amazing. I think Dr. Rabin would agree with that as well. Wow, that was incredible. Thank you so much, Miss Marie, and please say my best to David, and I'm conveying my sincerest love to the Kashkul's kid, newborn baby.
I will.
Like, Yalla, Miss Marie, have a very good day or night. I think it's the afternoon or the morning with you.
It's still morning.
It's still morning. Okay, it's getting late with us.
Yalla,
Miss Marie. Isn't that
Miss
Marie? By the way, I was just thinking about it. You were in Los Angeles, And I am in Doha, and a lot of our people are in Sulaimani in Kurdistan, and probably from some other places. And we're all talking about Kurdistan and Kurdish poetry. How beautiful that is. I think it's worth taking a moment and appreciate this. Thank you all very much, my friends.
Yes.
And I will be sharing this live later on. And for those of you who haven't watched the full conversation. Yalla Msmari Jan, be very well and Khwa Hafiz.
Salam. See you soon.